Oh, has Bernard sent a message?
Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun.
Hello, everybody. You will have seen that the co-host seems to be the host today. Our lovely host, Bernard Hickey, is delivering a speech right now, or as my daughter used to say, travelling the world talking bollocks. But he'll be on some way through the show. So I'm going to start it off, and I'm also going to say to everybody, if you would like to, do flick up some questions on the chat in YouTube, and I will do my best to answer them. Bernard had an interesting, so Bernard's going to be on shortly. Bernard had an interesting experience this week where a relative was in hospital and having a difficult situation, and it was really a sort of alarming discovery, I think, for Bernard to see through the day just how bad things can be in an ED in Wellington, and how vulnerable we all are. And we'll talk a little bit about that, I think, later in the show, because we will get to Simeon Brown, who of course is the Minister of Health now. What we're going to talk about today is we will do climate with Catherine Dyer shortly. Robert Patman from Otago University will come in to discuss international affairs, and we will have somebody from Octopus Energy coming in when Bernard comes back to discuss questions around the supply of electricity, the domination of gentailers in New Zealand, and all sorts of other aspects. Now, a couple of things I wanted to talk about a little bit. I'm not going to fully address the C word issue that came up in Parliament this week and came from Andrea Vance at the Post. I remember reading it at the time and being slightly shocked that they felt it was appropriate to put it that way in the paper, but I understood the determination and energy. And it's also kind of interesting to me in a way, in a country where an entire spate of advertising was linked to the word bugger. So, you know, we maybe don't need to quite be quite as sort of cautious about this. And I guess it also brings up the issue, which I want to talk to Bernard a little bit when he comes back in, about parliamentary behaviour, because it was a distraction. It was a deliberate distraction. I think a number of people have used it very effectively to distract from the policy change that we discussed last week in regard to equal pay settlements, and it is going to make it difficult for those. And also, it's worth remembering that the Andrea Vance piece from the Post was a piece of commentary. It wasn't a piece of news as such. It was, you know, she needed to be allowed to have a little bit of passion there. But thinking of parliamentary behaviour, I was also struck this morning listening to the Te Pāti Māori spokespeople, and also Judith Collins again talking about the decisions of the Parliamentary Privileges Committee, or the proposal from the Parliamentary Privileges Committee to really impose what can only be described as a draconian punishment on the Te Pāti Māori leaders and colleagues for doing the haka in Parliament. And it seemed to me that the haka should be probably an entirely legitimate piece of behaviour, or an outpouring in a sense, particularly in relation to that issue. So I may be naive in that, and as I say, I'm prepared to take, without turning this into a talkback show, because as you know, Bernard doesn't like looking at the chat, I'm very happy to take questions on it, or to get your views a little bit and express those what's coming through the chat. I was also struck this week, just very briefly, because we sometimes talk about media, and we're going to go into environment with Catherine shortly. Sean Plunkett, who I try not to look at, but accused this week, literally, Helen Clark's husband, Peter Davis, of being literally, quotes, anti-Semitic, close quotes. And it was one of those things very similar to what's happened with, in a slightly smaller way, with Gary Lineker in the UK, where Peter Davis, who is the founder really of the Helen Clark Foundation and a respected Auckland academic, retweeted something he probably shouldn't have, about graffiti in Wellington related to Gaza, and got jumped on immediately by the usual suspects. But what I was really surprised by was Sean Plunkett rather provocatively, literally accusing him of anti-Semitism. And I know Peter Davis a little bit, and the idea that he's anti-Semitic is bordering on ridiculous, and actually in a way bordering on comical. So it was kind of interesting that he was defamed both by the Israel Institute and by Sean in a way that was very provocative, and of course is related to his connection to Helen Clark. But it's also worth noting that Sean, I believe, took an expenses paid trip recently to Israel, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, although I don't think he disclosed exactly who paid for it, to see the Israeli perspective, to see, I think, because I was offered the same trip and declined it for kind of obvious reasons. In fact, I may have mentioned that before. But, I'm not questioning Sean's ability to go there, but it's probably good to disclose that a little more fully than he has, and especially if he's going to accuse other people of anti-Semitism. So like I said, we've got Catherine Dyer now. Now, Catherine, how are you getting on?
Good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm winging it a tiny bit with our fabulous leader, our dear leader, not here at the moment. Now, there's a number of stories I want to raise with you, and there was a couple that Bernard wants to raise with you. I really was very interested, again, if you don't mind, if we start with this concept of net zero as a dangerous trap, because a couple of weeks ago we talked about Tony Blair calling into question the UK pursuit of net zero and whether people were going to be able to digest it. And you've just sent me a note about the people from the IPCC, the International Interplanetary, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, talking about why the sort of pursuit of net zero may actually be dangerous in its own, or politically dangerous. Could you just explain? And then we'll be talking about solar power, various things around there, and some power issues in New Zealand.
So the net zero thing, these are two different groups coming at it from completely different ends of the spectrum in terms of what we ought to be doing and how we're doing it. So there's a group of scientists, researchers who believe that that focusing on net zero is potentially problematic when you should be focusing on actual or real zero, like getting all of your carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, or particularly carbon dioxide, though, down to real zero, rather than offsetting it with things that could change, or that, are temporary storage only, or all this sort of thing. On the other hand, you've got people who think that all of the targets to reduce carbon dioxide emissions are too strict and want them to be relaxed a bit. And so they are saying that net zero is too much to ask for. So those are two completely opposite ends of the spectrum. So when you say net zero is dead, it kind of is like, well, which group of these people are you talking about when you say that? Are you think that they're too stringent, the targets, or do you think that they're not stringent enough? So that's the first thing. The second thing that springs to mind for me when we talk about, we often talk about net zero by 2050, for instance. I don't know how many people are aware that when the Paris Agreement was originally signed, and we're going all the way back to 2015, 2016 when it was finally signed, all of the pathways to 1.5 degrees by the year 2100, which is what some of the modelling looks at, all of the pathways that aimed to get to 1.5 degrees by 2100 overshot 1.5 degrees mid-century. So the plan was always pretty much that we
Yes.
were going to go sailing past 1.5 degrees. That has been the plan pretty much
Or the understanding
for
at
the last
least.
decade.
Yeah.
And so as we approach 1.5 degrees and people start kind of panicking, you kind of go, well, actually, that's
Always been
I
the
don't know how
plan.
well that was communicated, but that was kind of part of the plan. But the plan included in the back half of the century that we were going to pull a whole lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere using technology like carbon capture and storage and Beck's version of it and all this sort of thing. So things that we didn't know if they would work or if they would be scalable. And so there were a lot of people 10 years ago who were saying that's kind of risky. We should have some pathways that don't overshoot because we may not be able to do what you think we're going to be able to do in
And
the back
pull it
half
back.
of the century.
Yeah.
So there were people saying that back then, but those voices didn't seem to be travelling very far.
And Catherine,
and the
that
closer we
presumably is going to. I mean, sorry, forgive me. Do you worry that that will lead to divisions or climate change skeptics being able to sort of put a cigarette paper between IPCC people and say, well, 15 years ago they were in agreement. They're now in disagreement. The policy is in disarray. Is that? Do you worry about that being weaponized?
I mean, there's always something that people can weaponize if they choose to. I think what needs to happen is some more adult conversations that include the assumptions that you're building into all of these pathways and points that you're agreeing on. If you're not clear about what the assumptions are, then people are surprised by the things that actually happen when they happen. What often happens with the modelling is that there's all these assumptions made that people are kind of individual consumers that make decisions where they purchase offsets or they don't purchase. Everything gets kind of turned into these market-based formulas, and that doesn't really take into account the realities of people's political and social and cultural lives and how messy that gets and how complex the decision making is, and then people are surprised when things don't go to plan.
Are you worried then that this kind of questioning of the existing targets or the how to get there is going to kind of lead to a sort of mass, a little bit like COVID, really, a little bit like some of the misunderstanding. In fact, it was interesting hearing Michael Baker talk this morning about the flu on the wireless, and he made the point that was probably not made adequately globally during COVID, which was that the vaccines are going to mean less hospitalization. They don't necessarily prevent you getting it, but the likelihood will be less, and so on. These nuances that are very important nuances in science, that this will leave people confused or allow people to exploit that confusion.
I think it's worse if you say something 10 years ago and then decide we can't change anything going forward because that might confuse people. The situation changes and you have to be able to have those discussions. If as a society you cannot have those discussions sensibly, then you're in trouble whether or not you decide to change the target or not. You have to be able to react to what is actually happening in the moment. And that it is worrying that it's getting harder and harder to have those discussions with the public, it's the divisions and polarities that happen around the use of social media and mainstream media shutting down, and all of those things make it more difficult to have, and more crises happening, having more climate change impacts which affect us. All of those things make those conversations more difficult to have, and the reality is that we need to be having those conversations with a little more complexity and subtlety in them than what we've been having to date, and unfortunately the space for that seems to be shrinking rather than growing. I don't know what to say about what the risks are of that. The risks are high.
Very. The disinformation and misinformation area. There was Bernard and I were talking this week about a story by in the Centrist, which is apparently supported by Jim Grennan, the guy who's buying NZME, and it compared historic climate data. When I say climate data, reports from papers past of record temperatures and so on, going back to the 1880s in Canterbury, and use those to then say that NIWA's data was all wrong, and that there was a sort of pursuit of an agenda at NIWA to be pro global warming.
That sounds pretty dodge. I mean,
It was Ian, a chap
there's always
called
been
Ian
records,
Wishart,
right?
I remember.
At any point in time, there will always be records that you can point to. But what's important then is records compared to what? What's the context? What's the background information? What are they
Yeah.
differing from? You know,
And the
so
trends.
yeah,
Yeah.
you can always manipulate data and cherry pick information and create claims that are dodgy. It's really just a matter of, can you afford to get your claims highlighted on a platform
Yes.
as
Yes,
that
exactly.
particular guy can. Yeah.
And Catherine, Bernard suggested that you also look at this FOI, Freedom of Information Act request that Mark Dawder has done, which has shown that Simeon Brown, the former Energy Minister, now Health Minister, was a little bit evasive or unwilling to take up the suggestion that the government might support the installation of solar panels on
Yeah.
domestic dwellings.
So it's quite interesting. This dates back to a time frame when Simon Watts, the Minister for Climate Change, was looking for other ideas to help us to meet our targets, basically, and did a whip round. And one of the ideas that had come up was some incentives for rooftop solar. And the Minister for Energy at the time was Simeon Brown, and he was very quick to shoot that down and to ensure it doesn't happen. When we go into the kind of energy issues that we've got at the moment in the market, and what's likely to be emerging over the winter months in terms of people's sensitivity to price, the idea that we are not, to me anyway, the idea that we are not investing in more distributed energy formats that increase resilience and increase people's ability to manage their own power usage and supply much
Yes.
better through rooftop solar. It just staggers me that that's not, high on the energy agenda, and finding out that Simeon Brown was playing a role in nixing that idea.
Yeah, what was the word you called? Noping.
I said he was noping. He noped
Noping.
it.
I had to look up what the hell noping meant, but yeah, being a bit of a yes man myself, I had to look up noping. And Catherine, you raised an issue today with us ahead of the show about the Endeavour grants, the Endeavour research grants. Could you explain what's happened there and what that might mean?
Yeah.
And then
So
we'll move to Robert.
Endeavour research grants are administered by MBIE, and they are the largest contestable funds, science funds, that are available for researchers. And the government and MBIE put out a notice today saying that they were pausing or suspending the applications for that grant for the 2026 year. So I think the applications start around early next year. That they were going to pause them for a year while they transition the science innovation, funding background, and that they were also inviting researchers who already had grants through that system to ask for extensions for a year. Basically, I think that the extensions thing was so that to try and stop the flow of researchers overseas, because the research funding scenario in New Zealand has become so poor. Does this
combine with that science review, the Gluckman review, which seemed to be ignored, and they did almost exactly the opposite of what Peter suggested?
Yeah,
I mean, is this calling into question the state of science?
Yeah, it's getting pretty frustrating for researchers. I think there's been this enormous amount of uncertainty and constant changes over the last couple of years. We people knew that there were some reviews going on, and that made sense. Nobody objected to that. But every time you look up, there's another opportunity for research funds has been taken away, noped or nixed. And that definitely has an impact on the entire body of researchers. People can't just put their careers on hold for years while they wait for the government to sort its stuff out on this. Like the review, the Gluckman review was done a long time ago. There were delays in responding to it. There have been the government seems to have implemented anything that allows them to cut money off the bottom line, or to suspend the spending of money for a while at any rate in order to meet the budget, but without giving us any certainty about what's what's going to be happening.
Catherine,
in the future.
just because I said I'd take some, because Bernard's not here, I said I'd take some questions from the audience. Artie Farty 87 asks us whether you are concerned that we may have data withheld, or that I don't know whether he's quite saying whether this NIWA Met Office schmozzle will lead to that, or are you concerned about access to data and quality data?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of insider knowledge about what's happening there. I know that I can see where there might be some concerns around ongoing studies or collection of data and what happens to that. And I think we'd probably need to get somebody from NIWA or Met Office to kind of answer those questions, because I'm not sure what the process of merging things is going to be like. But
because it was interesting to see that the in the US after Doge, the NOAA, the National Weather Organization, is now short of forecasters, surprise, surprise, in places where there are hurricanes and
one of the big things
weather.
that's just come out there around NOAA is that they're shutting down a database that was keeping stock of big weather events and the economic impact of those. So they're shutting down that, and that means that insurers and people in general don't have a very good sense of what to expect in the future and how much it's going to cost them and where those things might happen. And I know that it was pointed out that here in New Zealand we never did have a track of that. We're not keeping track of those things. We don't have a database that compares to that. And,
I'll bet some of the insurers
perhaps
do.
we ought to. The insurance companies will have their own, but it would be nice to know what to expect from that quarter as well, because of course whether you get insurance or not for your house or your business is fundamental to the way so many things in the economy work. That you need to have some public information here that people can understand and get their heads around.
I think it's, yes. Don't worry your pretty heads about it. We've got it sorted out. Catherine, thank you so much. We'll move to Robert and the Professor Robert Patman from Otago University, and go into international affairs, which of course I know you deal with brilliantly too, Catherine. Thanks very much. Robert, how are you?
I'm good, fine, thanks, Peter. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you. I'm winging it a tiny bit since Bernard is delivering a speech at the moment, which and then I guess he may come to my place immediately after. I don't know. I thought we might actually flip the order of things that I was going to ask you about, and ask you about something that's been slightly controversial in New Zealand. Slightly controversial in the sense that I started the show. In fact, also one of the things I mentioned was a claim from Sean Plunkett's show, The Platform, after he had David Cumin from the Israel Institute on, and they accused Helen Clark's husband of anti-Semitism. Now, you've stepped into this a little bit this week by signing this thing called the Otago Declaration, which I've known the Israel Institute has now attacked as part of the boycott Israel movement, and that is sort of academically and intellectually bankrupt. Do you want to explain what it is and why you felt comfortable signing up to it?
Well, firstly, it's been under discussion within the university for some time, and it is based on international respect for international law, and also the judgments that have flowed from the International Court of Justice that said that there is a plausible case that Israel has been committing genocide against the Palestinian people. And it's also mindful that the ICC have arrest warrants for two senior Israeli leaders, and also wanted to arrest a Hamas leader, although I think that person's departed from the scene. And also, I suppose, you know, this document, this declaration, is based on what I call peer-reviewed empirical evidence,
Yeah.
and the leading experts in the world. And I think it's an attempt to capture a university under the Education Act of 1989 is supposed to be critic and conscience of society. And in the eyes of many people in this country, the situation in Gaza is an international disgrace. And we've had, first of all, the Hamas attack was appalling on the 7th of October. But as the Secretary General pointed out of the UN, that attack didn't come out of a clear blue sky. There is occupation, illegal occupation, according to the International Court of Justice, of a number of Palestinian territories. And so I think the declaration is not some sort of hot-headed rush to judgment.
No.
And partisan. Is based on very careful assessment of the available evidence.
Yeah,
it reflects the fact that
forgive me, go ahead.
Students and academics feel that in 20 years' time, people will be asking, what was done? Where were you when this was going on? And many people feel they should express some moral clarity about the situation that's going on. Let's be quite clear. It took a disgracefully long period, 15 months, to achieve a shaky ceasefire, which was then breached unilaterally by one party.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, there's been a 2-month blockade of food and water, and we are now reaching what appears to be a humanitarian catastrophe with people facing starvation. Where, unfortunately, much of the world is watching while this is going on. And I think there seems to be a void in global leadership, Peter.
Yes.
And I think this declaration is a sort of grassroots, if you like, bottom-up approach to say, okay, the university leadership's in an awkward position. It gets funding from a government that doesn't really want to talk about this, apart from when it's in the UN. So I think that's why I felt comfortable signing it.
Yeah, interesting, because I imagine you're not a big signer. I imagine petitions and things come and go. There's been some real thought behind this, clearly, from you as an academic.
I think a lot of the people, I know a lot of the people involved in doing so, and they're all careful, middle of the road balanced people. So it's being depicted as some sort of partisan, anti-Semitic document, and it's not. In fact, it's being supported by a lot of Jewish students, and the situation at the moment. I don't know why people object to people protesting about what is a humanitarian catastrophe.
Absolutely. I was quite struck, Robert, that in the furthermore part, it says Israel is committing a genocide against the Palestinian nation, according to experts, official bodies, international lawyers, and human rights organizations. And of course, I sent you something today from Tom Fletcher, who's one of the deputy secretary generals of the United Nations, saying, warning Israel that it was heading towards a genocidal situation, or that it would be, again, accused of genocide with this withholding of aid. And it also talks about Israel operates a system of apartheid in the territories it controls. And of course, that was a very controversial statement by Human Rights Watch a few years ago, which is a bit of a, that is a very controversial thing to say. And yet, these three things are arguable. You talk about genocide, apartheid, and this other one that is an interesting concept that I'm not sure I knew until I read it, about scholasticide, which is denying Palestinians their right to education, which is a really interesting one.
All the universities in Gaza have been destroyed.
Yeah.
Over 200 academics have been killed. Many students have been killed. And what other conclusion can you draw? Hospitals and the thing is, this is supposed to be a counter-terrorist campaign against Hamas. Okay. Well, the first rule of counterterrorism is you do not target civilians who are not involved with Hamas. Most Palestinians are not involved with Hamas. And there's been a presumption from the outset, and unfortunately, as the South Africans have revealed in their submission to the ICJ, there's been no shortage of statements by the Israeli government about the fact from the outset, some members, not all, but some members of the Israeli government presumed that there were no innocent Palestinians.
Absolutely.
And let's be quite clear about this. Has this action, and here I'm quoting Anthony Lowenstein, a Jewish Australian journalist, has what has happened since the 7th of October made Israel more secure? And he argues it has not. It is actually fueled anti-Semitism to some degree, and also made the plight or the security of Jewish people, both in Israel and outside it, less secure.
Yeah, I tried to get Anthony to come on. I've interviewed Anthony a couple of times, and of course, we're straying into some, not straying. We're going into some very difficult issues because, as you say, the phrase anti-Semitism gets weaponized in this. Some of the definitions of anti-Semitism include criticism of the state of Israel that you wouldn't necessarily.
One point I'd like to say, Peter, though,
forgive me,
is sorry to interrupt you, but I think this point needs to be made very, very carefully. Many of us always have traditionally wanted to support Israel, and the thing is, what is happening in Gaza is, in the eyes of many people who consider themselves pro-Israeli, not actually in Israel's interest. And Mr. Rabin, back in the 90s, took the view that Palestinians should have self-determination, they should have a state. But the current government, which is not necessarily representative of all Israelis,
correct,
takes the view that the Palestinians should not have a state.
Yeah, I just think it's a very difficult thing when one says, you know, Anthony Lowenstein is a Jewish Australian journalist, or there are Jewish students who support this. We know that to be the case, but it's you know, it means that we're all very conscious of those claims of anti-Semitism. So
yeah, but I think we have to come back to that document is a response to the fact that authoritative international institutions, Peter, with careful weighing up of definitions of what constitute war crimes and breaches of humanitarian law, have reached the conclusion that those things have occurred. And should governments which subscribe to an international rules-based order which prohibits crimes against humanity, should they sit in silence while those things are happening?
Yeah, and to the people in our chat who are saying that I'm looking uncomfortable, it's not so much that I'm looking uncomfortable. It's just that I have a long experience reporting on and going to Israel, being in the story, being involved in the story, and you know, we have to try to balance it as best we can with just the three of us here, without doing both sidesism. So just going, Robert, to the events of this week, do you detect that there is a gap opening up between Benjamin Netanyahu and Trump on this? I mean, Trump's focus. We discussed the trip. I still expected him to potentially do a trip to Israel, but the trip to the Middle East is so commercial, so weirdly commercial, that you know, is he leaving Netanyahu hanging out there?
That seems to be the perception. Ori Goldberg, who is an astute political observer from Israel, seems to believe that Mr. Netanyahu has not liked some of the policies, that he didn't like the fact that the Americans negotiated with Hamas without Israel's involvement, and has not liked the fact that you know, Mr. Witkoff is also, he's got, there's a number of issues. Obviously, there's a dialogue going on between those governments, but there is a sense I think there's a perception that, Ori Goldberg referred to, that Netanyahu may feel somewhat let down by Trump's leadership. He assumed that America First was consistent with the policies that the current Netanyahu government are following, including the denial of the right to self-determination for the Palestinians. And that may not prove to be the case. America First may actually have quite distinct, independently of Israel, different approaches.
Yeah, but we know from the tariffs thing that Trump is likes to be extreme, likes to be volatile, likes to be hard to read. Robert, what on that score, what did you make of his rather extraordinary meeting with the new leader in Syria, and what that might mean, in fact, of course, for Israel?
I think the Saudis were very keen for that to happen. And I think there's a bit of quid pro quo here. I'm not saying that Mr. Trump didn't want to do it. I think he sounded genuinely enthusiastic after he met the Syrian leader. But I think that the Saudis, which have good connections with Washington, I think had impressed upon Trump that this was an important step, that Syria had an opportunity to turn a page and put the past behind them with a leader who appears to be moderate and is willing to take tough decisions, and basically take Syria in a new economic and political direction. And they made the case, I believe, in private initially, that it will be tragic if this opportunity was missed.
Yes.
And that the sanctions will, unfortunately, while they're in place, somewhat preempt attempts by the new government to get Syria back on its feet. And of course, the Gulf states do have an interest in this, because Syria is bang in the middle of the Middle East, and they obviously see economic opportunities as well.
Robert, before we flick to Ukraine, which Bernard is just itching to have a go at, and come in and steal my thunder from having blard for a while. I'm not fidgeting when Robert comes on and talks to Gaza, by the way, whoever said that on the chat, you buggers.
Just my effect, Peter.
I wonder whether the Syrian meeting, aside from all the graft and the corruption and the Qatari 747 and all that, made you think, God, maybe Trump can bring imaginative change. Maybe he can be a different kind of diplomat.
Well, Mr. Trump's always been unpredictable. We haven't mentioned another issue in which Netanyahu is very upset with Mr. Trump, and that is Iran. And the fact that the Americans are negotiating with Iran very toughly, they say, but
bigly toughly, yeah.
But they are, Mr. Trump, while he was in the Middle East, said he wants Iran to thrive. He wants Iran to have a great future, a peaceful future, and I'm not sure those words will go down particularly well with Netanyahu's government, which sees Iran as a real clear and present danger, so to speak. So I think there's some. Mr. Trump. The trouble is, he doesn't seem to have a coherent plan. He fires off things like, I think I own Gaza, which cause enormous problems. So I would say his improvisation sometimes opens up new possibilities, but the fact he's often improvising also causes enormous problems. Yeah. So you have to weigh the advantages of improvisation against the huge disadvantages of not really having a clear, coherent approach where everybody understands.
Yeah, I almost found myself thinking there was a sort of a little chink there when I thought maybe we do have to potentially give him credit for a different way of doing things and imagination, but we can just put that away and see if it fruits.
Just a footnote though, Peter, what you were talking about. It's very interesting to note that the Democrats are really getting stuck in to Trump. I saw that Adam Schiff called it. It was Chris Murphy. He called it Trump's corruption tour, and Schiff has made a devastating critique of Trump's unwillingness to abide by constitutional constraints on receiving foreign gifts. And there's a lot, this is quite interesting because I think this 2 senators, the gloves seem to have come off. And I think a lot of people wondered why it's taken so long for the Democrats. After all, Mr. Trump has presented plenty of opportunities for the Democrats to get stuck into him. And yet they
waited for the 747.
Yeah, they seem to have thought this is an issue they can safely, go after him on. So it'd be interesting to see what happens.
Bernard, the tall boy at the back of the class, you're dying to ask Robert about Ukraine.
Great to see you all.
Yeah, it was great to see you,
Thank you very
Bernard.
much for waiting and being patient. Yeah, I'm curious about this meeting coming up between Putin, Zelensky, and Trump, and what you think might come out of it, because it looks like Trump seems to have sort of worked out that Putin doesn't keep his word.
Well, we just don't know whether Putin will be there.
Well, he's almost certainly not, because he's not even sending the foreign minister.
No, but he's sending a key aide, and he's also cleared according to a very good source, he has no appointments on Thursday. He's cleared his desk, so to speak. So he could make a sudden appearance, unscheduled and unexpected. After all, Mr. Putin's pretty paranoid about his own personal security. And so he would be worried to announce in advance that he's going to Istanbul, because he may worry about becoming in a situation that might compromise his security.
Well, I did have to look up today, of course, whether Turkey is a member of the ICC, and of course it is not, because it would not be, as we've seen with Netanyahu going to Hungary, it's very difficult to go to somewhere where you're an indicted war criminal.
And there's another issue that's been raised. Did he really ever intend to go to Istanbul? Was it just a maneuver? He thought that Zelensky would refuse to meet him, and therefore he made the offer to meet him. But of course he called his bluff, and he said, yeah, okay, that's fine. Of course, with a nudge from Mr. Trump. So yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see whether he does turn up. Zelensky said he won't meet any other Russian officials other than Putin. Putin
which is a very clever move, and of course, Putin barely recognizes Zelensky as the.
Oh, he regards him as an inferior, and the Russian officials say that. Peskov virtually said that. Yeah, they regard him as a Nazi.
Bernard.
So realistically, what's going to happen here, Robert? Because Trump's going to turn up. Putin doesn't turn up.
Will
it's
he?
like
Will
a slap
Trump
in the
turn up?
face.
Trump won't turn up. Well, sorry. But
Trump
Bernard,
might turn
why
up
is
if
Trump
Putin's
turn
there.
up?
Yeah.
I think the
it's
Americans are going to send Rubio and maybe Steve Witkoff to speak to Zelensky in Istanbul. This is all speculation. None of us know what's going to happen. But, he's got a very big delegation with him, Bernard, in the Gulf states. And he's going to the United Arab Emirates next, I believe. And he's being accompanied by some hard hitters, so to speak. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of those go to Istanbul at some point. I think Zelensky has actually been manoeuvring quite cleverly between.
Yes, he has, especially since that awful White House meeting.
Yeah, he's a quick learner, clearly. And but I think the other thing is that it struck me as extraordinary that Trump and Zelensky have both joined together and demanded a 30-day ceasefire. And then as soon as Putin said, oh, no, I don't want a ceasefire, but I want negotiation, Trump immediately flipped and said, you've got to go and meet Putin in Istanbul. It's a tremendous change, so to speak. So,
Robert, thank you so much for coming in and
thank you.
and winging it with me a little tiny bit. And I love that conversation about the Otago Declaration, which I think people can probably search for and find. I think it's a really interesting thing of you to have done, and I know you wouldn't have signed it without serious thought and consideration. So we'll move on to Margaret and to domestic issues in New Zealand.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Bye.
It's lovely to see you, Margaret. Thank you for coming on to the Hoon. Margaret Cooney is the Chief Operating Officer at Octopus Energy in New Zealand. Margaret, lovely to have you on to talk about all of the dramas in our electricity market this week.
Yeah, not good news, unfortunately, in electricity.
Maybe tell us what those couple of those dramas are.
Yeah, what did you think of?
Yeah, well, I guess
Sure.
if you look at my background, I attempted to display some of it, but the graph is inverted. So I guess there's been a period over the last really 8 years where the market has been quite crazy and the prices have been really elevated. So this chart behind me really shows that since 2020, we've had a doubling in the wholesale costs of electricity. Yeah. And a consequence of that has been that, independent players like Flick have and ourselves have really struggled to compete because we haven't been able to access wholesale cover. There's ongoing competition issues, and I think we've had we've had Flick close, we've had New Zealand wind farms, an independent generator purchased by Meridian. We've had the Flick customer base picked up by Meridian. We've had Manawa Energy picked up by Contact. So we're going from probably about 85% concentration to 87% in the retail and 85 to about 90 something in the generation. So the industry is just getting more and more concentrated.
So is this the shock that will convince everyone that something has to change, or is it just like, well, we expected that to happen and this is normal and let's get back to making some really big dividends for our shareholders?
Well, I think the other thing which has happened this week is we've had Transpower come out. They've got responsibilities to monitor the risk across the electricity system, and basically they've produced a report that highlights that actually we've got a real problem. We're just not getting enough new supply coming in to meet demand. And so next year we're going to breach the security levels that we have in place in market. So there's an increasing risk of outages, and there's been this really strong signal of the need for new generation, but we just haven't had the follow through. There has been issues with gas supply, which are definitely a factor in there, but still, this has gone on for many years. So I hope that the minister is sitting there and, thinking really hard about what needs to change to support better competition.
Because Margaret, without bringing you into the politics, and Bernard might answer this because I wasn't here when it happened, but I was aware of it. The sale of the generation capacity, privatisation of the generation capacity, really made it very difficult for a minister to have that kind of national interest decision on the environmental aspects and so on. I mean, I think it would still be very difficult to build more hydro, even that it's desirable. But without asking you to be political, I mean, that is the problem, isn't it? That we have, we privatized the generators, and
no, I don't think it is. No? I think that actually one of the real challenges is the market's so tied up with the incumbents with vertical and who are vertically integrated, and just hasn't evolved like other markets to accommodate the contracting that you really need to allow new entrants to come in and build generation. And I think we've had plenty of international players that have said that, look, if you sort your market out, there's an opportunity for us to come into New Zealand. And so I think that's where the focus needs to be, because the prices are so high that you can build new generation in New Zealand, but you need to have an offtake. And that's where, given that the sector is so concentrated, you're dependent on dealing with the gentailers.
So creating these virtual, in a sense, virtual. I want to ask you a question actually after Bernard's asked you the next one, but to have that offtake of the power, we need a more liberalised market with entrants like Octopus. Is that right?
That's correct, and
Yeah.
some regulation around how those gentailers operate.
Yeah. Bernard, please.
So just Margaret, in terms of what the government could physically do and what the electricity authority could do in terms of making the market more transparent and making it easier for independent retailers to buy power at a wholesale price that's reasonable. What would need to change?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the Electricity Authority had a consultation out that closed last week, actually, which was around, it was called level playing field options. And it's this idea of being able, or allowing independent players to access the market and compete effectively. And that proposed a number of options in there. What they are proposing at the moment is some non-discrimination principles, which means basically if you're vertically integrated, you need to deal with any entrant players on an equivalent basis to your own retail or generation arm. So I guess that's a good principle. It should have already been happening. Otherwise, question what's happening with our competition law and market monitoring. But anyway, so good principle to have, but I think practically we know from experience in other sectors that you actually need more robust regulation than that. And the OECD have highlighted that structural forms of separation and either operational or ownership separation should be considered. I think we could go to an operational separation model, and that would resolve the majority of the issues. So the idea there would be you can own both, but actually they need to be operating at arm's length from each other. So yeah,
Mark,
do you really think they can do that? That
Sorry,
they can have these Chinese walls in a way that means that their profits fall and their dividends fall? Because the moment that happens, Treasury jumps up to the government and says, "Hey, you're just taking $200, $300, $500 million of dividends off the table. That's extra money you're going to have to borrow. Stop allowing this."
Yeah, I mean, that's another issue is the residual ownership of government in the state entities. And I'm not sure how much that stops them acting on this, but you must be the Minister of Finance at the moment sitting there and going, well, for every 5% increase in electricity prices, there's almost a 0.5% reduction in productivity. So it's a false economy thinking the dividends of gentailers are a good thing. And you have seen the flight of industry over the past year with the paper mills exiting. And I think more importantly, the lost opportunity to recruit new businesses to New Zealand. This is material stuff. It's the dividends of the gentailers don't make up for that.
Margaret, before you came in, we had our normal session with Catherine Dyer at the beginning on climate. Sorry, Bernard, is that all right if I did stick my finger up, as it were, which as you do. And one of the things we discussed was a report this week that's come out that showed that Simeon Brown objected to an idea of incentivizing New Zealanders to put solar cells on their houses and feeding the stuff back onto the grid. Now, I know I was looking you up today, and I know you've got a lot of experience in the UK. 15 years ago, I was selling electricity back from my George Osborne had a very high pass rates, very high sell back rate at one point for my solar cells. What do you think about that from a New Zealand perspective, from an Octopus perspective? And also, could you talk a little bit about the sort of bigger question of regulation? Because New Zealand really followed the UK model to some extent on regulation of Ofwat and Ofgen and so on. And do you have a view about your regulator and whether it works or whether
there's a lot in that question?
Yes.
Shall we start with the distributed energy piece?
Thank you.
So I think it's an interesting question. We haven't had as good an uptake of solar as we ideally should have in New Zealand, and I think you could look at ways to subsidise that to accelerate the uptake, because it does have some resilience benefits. But equally, the message needs to go out to all New Zealanders that actually the payback on this is really good. Like you should be doing it now, because it will save you money. And I think part of the equation here needs to be, the real estate agents and everyone else in the ecosystem being able to translate that value to consumers, because the payback is down to probably about 5 to 7 years for most
which
households.
Is astounding for the ease, the sort of, and it's long term. That kind of long term benefit that all of a sudden you realize you're doing good and making money, or potentially saving money.
Yeah, and it's great when we think about the picture of trying to electrify our economy and decarbonize it. Adding solar on a house is a great way to be able to offset the increased usage from an electric vehicle. And as soon as you do that, again, the payback comes down.
Yeah, and Margaret,
further.
just before Bernard does his final question, just could you address the regulatory question? I'm not asking you to crap all over your existing regulator, but somebody points out, of course, that Ofwat in the water regulator in the UK would appear to have been captured by the water companies, and it's a disaster there. Ofgem less so. What's the regulatory situation, and do you need the energy regulator to be combined with the Comcon, for example?
Look, I think there are real concerns about the electricity authorities' failure to recognise risks and address them. So we've seen a situation over 8 years that has kind of just got worse and worse and worse. And throughout that entire time, the message from the gentailers that, we've got this under control, don't do anything, has been bought. And I think all regulators should always be skeptical of all participants. And unfortunately, I think they've lacked some of that skepticism and that, really digging into what's going on and monitoring the sector. So I'm sure there will be some recommendations that come out of the review that focus on what they've been doing. I do think they have recently been very focused on this level playing field stuff and been working as quickly as they can to do something. So you have to acknowledge the massive effort that's going in there. I guess I'm also concerned that, Treasury and the MB are super conservative, and even the telcos reform, they probably were suggesting that it shouldn't happen, and I'm sure that's the advice ministers will be getting about reform to the electricity
let me slip another one in here then, because you're so sorry, Bernard, I know I said you were going to do the final, but because you've got that experience in the UK, it's kind of interesting, the whole concept of a virtual power operator, which I think Octopus is, the MVNO, the mobile virtual network operators, Virgin, and here I think 2 Degrees is virtual, and then you've got the same sort of thing happening in fintech and smart banking. Can a market of 5.5 million people sustain that kind of competition, and what would it require? It's kind of an interesting, all of these things are virtual, but they often work better in a bigger market.
Well, the New Zealand industry, when it was deregulated, it didn't involve gentailers. That was something that evolved just through acquisitions. So it's set up so that it can work with independent players. And I think increasingly, going back to the point about the role of distributed energy and the ability to help manage consumers' demand smartly, that's, you've got more incentive to do that effectively if you are an independent retailer. And I think there, that is part of the equation of keeping the energy system really affordable. So, like taking the UK examples, we do some really interesting stuff there. When there's an abundance of wind, we will actually ask people to increase their consumption, and that's for free, or we provide the electricity to lots of the charge point operators for EVs, and the price will go down 40%. So these are the type of things that you can do if you've got a more vibrant and agile operator, and that's part of the reason why we need this reform in New Zealand.
Just one final one from
Final.
Margaret. There's so much, there's so much margin in these prices now, and the costs of generating electricity, storing it, and then using it in a vehicle, particularly if that vehicle has a battery that can interact with the house and with the network overall, that all you'd need is a combination of a bank, some sort of financier, some sort of car maker, and some sort of panel and battery producer, and perhaps someone in the market to get together, and you'd actually have a really strong, purely economic case to launch something which uses the low costs and the ability to use the vehicle as your home battery to actually, reduce your transport costs, reduce your housing costs, and essentially do away with the market.
It's starting to happen. Well, I think, you all feed into the same market in that scenario. You still need the market in the middle.
I don't want to feed into the market. I don't trust it anymore. I'm sick of waiting for the damn thing to reform. I just want to abandon it.
Oh, you're prepping.
What you should have then?
You should see the bunker underneath Bernard's house, because it's right next door to a swamp. And I think if Bernard and I dug down a little bit, he'd have wet feet.
Yeah, look, I don't think it's that bad. I think it. The problems can be solved.
Because I know I could save money.
Yeah, the problems can be solved in the market. We just need a decisive, bold minister to move with it. So I think, that New Zealand has the opportunity to, if we get things right in electricity, we will increase the affordability for households, because unlike the rest of the world, we don't have cheap gas or oil. All of this is very expensive, and electrification delivers savings to households.
Yeah.
So we really need to do our bit to kind of scale the sector and restore confidence in it.
Margaret, thank you so much for coming on and being patient with us. Bernard, I'm going to go to silly mid-on this cricket field and give Bernard bowl Bernard a googly rather, not a ghoulie.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Margaret. Bernard, I'm going to
Thank you very much,
because
Margaret.
you've been a little bit of delay and so on. We're having to sort of again wing it a tiny bit. The usual person is asking whether we can have somebody from Israel. Yes, we can, and we should, and we have in the past, and it won't be you, but I will. We should. Bernard, KiwiSaver changes announced today. You did a thing in one of your other podcasts about the Australian superannuation. Do you want to do a little quick soliloquy about KiwiSaver versus Australian superannuation?
Yeah, I mean, way back in 1994, when Paul Keating created the Australian Superannuation Fund, it was an opportunistic thing to deal with a particular problem. The government wanted to avoid a wage inflation spike that would put up interest rates. So he did a deal where the union movement agreed not to put up wages. and employers agreed to provide some of those wage increases in the form of a contribution to a super fund. And now Australia has this $4 trillion fund, which will be, within a couple of years, the second biggest in the world, as in terms of a pool of pension funds. That's for a country, it's only got 20 million people, and it is underwriting their growth. Unfortunately, we are now in a position where, because we killed off the very similar type of fund that we had in 1972, the whole sort of dancing Cossacks reaction from Rob Muldoon, it means now that it means now that we're well behind. And unfortunately, governments of both flavours have kept nipping and tucking away at the subsidies for KiwiSaver. Unfortunately, this government seems reluctant to encourage the sort of strong saving that is needed with a real subsidy.
It's in a way they should
KiwiSaver.
In a way they should call them incentives, Bernard, not subsidies, because they're incentives. They're not subsidies as such. It's trying to encourage people to save and to not create an even bigger problem with our superannuation than what you've got.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is again a function of the dirty little secret at the heart of our housing market with bits tacked on, and that is that leveraged investment in residential land is tax-free. And if you've got any spare money as a business or as a household, the first thing you do is put it into more residential land and leverage it up. And unfortunately, because of that, people, do whatever they can to take their money out of KiwiSaver as a deposit, or when they're absolutely desperate, they take the money out just to survive.
Exactly.
It's no longer the sort of thing that will actually make it sustainable to retire on KiwiSaver. You need something like the Australian Fund and compulsory contributions with some sort of subsidy. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And unfortunately, this government isn't grasping that nettle. In fact, is using KiwiSaver as another way to save money, which I think we'll see in the budget. That it is essentially KiwiSaver is an inconvenience. In the same way that the New Zealand Super Fund has been an inconvenience for the current government. And actually, what we learned this week is that the government effectively has made its last contribution to the New Zealand Super Fund this year, in part because the New Zealand Super Fund has performed so well that the formula that determines how much gets put in means that no more needs to be put in.
Good
and
luck.
Actually, it'll start paying back in to help pay for New Zealand Super from 2030, 3 years early. The problem, of course, is that if only we hadn't proposed the contribution in 2009 to 2007, the fund would be even bigger and more able to help us.
We always do that,
New Zealand
don't we?
superannuation crisis.
You delay. It's the classic citizens and ratepayers thing. You delay maintenance and you delay your contributions, so you just push it out to another generation.
It's essentially, again, it's throwing the future generations under the bus. And it's done in a sociopathic way because those future generations are our kids and our grandkids. And what they're doing right now is leaving the country in droves, 190 a day, including 15 kids and toddlers, to Australia and elsewhere because they can't afford to live in their own home, in part because houses are now investment vehicles, not places to live. And unfortunately, this government and the previous government, the Labor government, has yet to make a difference there.
Bernard, I need to get you to stop because I can just feel Simon's a little vein in Simon's forehead.
Fair enough.
Pulsing, but it was brilliant instant soliloquy, and you managed to tie it back to housing, which of course is now. People want to know if you're in the budget lockup.
Yes.
Good, excellent, and I think we know that Craig Rennie and those people got admitted back in. The various. I didn't realise that Eric Crampton had also been declined. I did vote in support in a sense on X about Craig, but yeah.
Yeah, and no, it's a 2-for-1 special. Basically, they were both locked out to make it seem fair. And after it looked the petty, mean thing it actually was, they decided to change their mind, which is good. But the fact that they even considered it to start with is not a good sign.
All right, quick skateboarding dog, Bernard.
Yes.
And I reckon some of this is a little bit potentially dodgy, but it is true. It has been shown on photograph that Saudi Arabia rolled out a mobile McDonald's truck for Donald Trump's first visit to the nation. A White House official confirmed that a mobile McDonald's food truck was in Riyadh during the Trump's visit. And quotes, Saudi Arabia brought in a mobile McDonald's for President Trump on his visit, said this little shit Benny Johnson, who is ghastly. Now, I suspect that the real reason is, of course, it's not to feed him, but it's a bloody good story. The real reason is that there's so many thousands of people around him, of course, that need to be fed. But it is a bloody good story, and Benny Johnson is a ghastly little SHIT instead of a see you next Tuesday, which I managed to burn it on the intro when you hear it.
Yes.
I managed not to use the see you next Tuesday.
Well done.
Yeah, but I did question whether in a country where we still say bugger, and have campaigns that talk about bugger, whether that was appropriate. But anyway, bugger off. Let's bugger off.
Yeah. Yes. Ka kite, everyone. See you next week.
Ka kite.
Bye-bye.
Good night.